Princess Alara stood over the gasping Vorak soldier, her hands trembling as she gripped the hilt of the human combat knife buried in his throat. Blood, a shocking dark violet, bubbled over her knuckles, clashing with the soft bioluminescence of her own skin. She didn't pull the blade out. She couldn't. Do you think a heart made for peace can survive the weight of a blade? Subscribe and walk with us through the ashes of Ethelgard. Now, let's see how a princess became a survivor. A month ago, the hardest decision she faced was which shade of starlight to weave into her hair. The wedding preparations had been a blur of silk and ancient hymns, a celebration of 3 centuries without a single drop of noble blood spilled on Aethelis Major. Her skin glowed with a soft, rhythmic amber as she sat before the vanity. It was the color of contentment, of a life lived in a world that had forgotten the meaning of a scar. Outside the window, the spires of the capital reached for the clouds like frozen music. The Ethelgard spent 3 centuries forgetting how to bleed. The sole Terrans never had the choice. The sovereign, her father, entered the room with a heaviness that dimmed his own bioluminescence to a dull gray. He spoke of the Vorak hegemony, of resource droughts, and the necessity of a buffer. To save their elegance, they needed a predator. They needed the humans. Alara met Thorn Vance in the high gardens. He wore a plain, charcoal-gray uniform that seemed to swallow the sunlight, and his face was a map of old trauma. While the Ethelgard moved like water, Thorn moved like a machine, efficient, quiet, and unsettlingly precise. He bowed according to the strictest protocols of her people. Yet she noticed his eyes never stopped scanning the perimeter. She wore stars in her hair, but he carried the weight of dead worlds in his eyes. The wedding was a political transaction disguised as a romance. In the weeks that followed, Thorn remained a ghost in the palace. He was polite, distant, and intensely observant. One morning, Alara found him in the courtyard before the suns had fully risen. He was moving through a sequence of strikes with a short, blackened blade. It was the Echo, a serrated piece of Solterran steel that looked like a jagged tooth. He didn't see her at first. His movements were a blur of lethal intent, a dance of violence that turned her stomach. When he finally noticed her, he didn't apologize. He simply wiped the sweat from his brow and sheathed the knife. "Peace is a luxury bought by those willing to be monsters in the dark," he said, his voice like grinding stones. He tried to warn them. At the Grand Council, Thorn stood before the glowing elders and spoke of fleet movements and orbital trajectories. He was dismissed as a paranoid warmonger, a primitive who saw ghosts in the stars. The sky didn't turn dark when the attack came. It turned white. The first orbital bombardment hit the shield generators at noon. The shock wave shattered the crystal spires, raining jagged glass down on the screaming crowds. Alara found herself huddled in a corridor, the air thick with dust and the smell of ozone. Is the cost of safety worth the soul of a civilization? We'll be here tomorrow to see what remains when the dust settles. Thorn appeared through the haze, his uniform torn, reaching out to pull her upward. He thrust the blackened knife into her hand. His fingers were hot against her cold skin. "Don't look at it," he commanded. "Just hold it. If they get past me, don't hesitate." She looked at the hunk of metal with pure disgust. To her, it wasn't a tool, it was a symbol of human savagery, a heavy, ugly thing that had no place in a world of light. The palace groaned under the weight of the bombardment. Dust choked the grand hallways, turning the once vibrant bioluminescent murals into ghostly smears of color. Thorn didn't move like a diplomat anymore. He moved like a storm, his boots rhythmic against the cracked marble as he organized the retreating palace guards. The guards were beautiful, tall, and utterly paralyzed. They held their ceremonial staves like ornaments, their eyes wide with a terror that comes from a life without conflict. He spoke in low, jagged commands, grabbing a captain by the shoulder and forcing him to look at the tactical map shimmering on a scorched wall. "They aren't here for your art," Thorn said, his voice cutting through the panic. "They are here for the sediment. If you want a world left to paint, you stand here. It was a lesson in the architecture of survival. The Ethelgard culture was built on the assumption of a shared morality, a belief that beauty was its own shield. But as the Vorak breached the inner sanctum, the primitive human wisdom proved vital. Vigilance wasn't a lack of peace. It was the fence that kept the peace from being trampled. Thorn's every move was a testament to the burden of the warrior, a specialized violence honed so that Alara wouldn't have to know it. Yet the synthesis was beginning. Alara found herself following his pace, her breathing sinking with the heavy thud of his boots. A door exploded. A Vorak assassin, armored in chitinous plates, lunged from the smoke. Thorn was already engaged with two others, his movements a blur of parries and brutal efficiency. The assassin ignored him, sensing the softer target. It moved toward Alara's father, its serrated claw raised to strike the sovereign. Time didn't slow down. It sharpened. Alara didn't think about the hems or the silk. She thought about the weight of the steel in her hand. And now, in the blood-slicked throne room, under the dying light of the chandeliers, she didn't hesitate. One of the invaders lunged. But she was faster, driven by a primal instinct she hadn't known she possessed. She felt the hilt of the human knife bite into her palm as she drove it home. The resistance of the armor gave way. The trembling in her hands didn't stop, but it changed from fear into a cold, focused resolve. The palace was silent when the Solteran reinforcements finally descended. They didn't arrive with music or ceremony. They came in pods that slammed into the courtyard, soldiers in heavy gear fanning out with a grim, practiced silence. Days later, the smoke had cleared, but the city was transformed. Alara stood on the balcony of the ruined palace, looking out over a landscape of scaffolding and watchtowers. She reached down and touched the sheath at her waist. The blackened knife was still there. It wasn't a symbol of savagery anymore. It was the price of her agency, a reminder that the stars are only beautiful because someone is willing to stand in the dark. Thorn joined her, his face bandaged, his eyes still scanning the horizon. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, two different worlds finally finding a common language in the quiet after the war.